The stream is about to begin.
All right, my teacher friends. So when I first heard Ronny Chieng's commencement speech at Harvard College this past year, I said, holy moly, this dude's speaking to the choir. I loved it, but here's the thing. It's riddled, laced with profanity. So I'm like, I can't use it. Bummer. So I did one on Eric Church's Six Strings. Every year I like to turn over my rhetorical analysis material. It mitigates the cheating. It mitigates my boredom. And I like to keep things fresh. I really wanted to use this. So what I did was I doctored up the transcript. And I got rid of all the curse words, all the profanity, and I softened them so that I could use it in class next year. So down below in the video's description, you can find that transcript, and you also can find all the slides that are forthcoming. So I'm going to walk you through the whole thing, like how I instruct my students to write rhetorical analysis. So you'll see my heuristic of the declarative thesis to house the introductory paragraph. And then, as always, all the body paragraphs are written syllogistically, and we'll even tag a conclusion on it for good measure. So from start to finish, you'll see a full-length essay come to fruition right before your eyes. All right, hope you enjoy this one. All right, my teacher friend. So let's roll with the prompt. Here's what I got cooking for us. The following passage is from comedian and actor Ronny Chieng, featured address delivered during Harvard College Class Day in May of 2026, addressing graduating seniors and their families. Chieng reflects on the challenges and opportunities awaiting students as they leave the university and enter an increasingly complex world. Read the passage carefully, then write an essay in which you analyze the rhetorical choices Chieng makes to convey his message to his audience. In your response, analyze how Chieng's choices contribute to the meaning and effectiveness of the speech. Avoid merely summarizing the passage. So just your average common fodder AP language prompt, no tricks, no thrills. Just a standard prompt. So the question becomes, as they stare at a blank sheet of paper or their Chromebooks, how do I write the intro? Well, let me demystify it for you. I have a little hack or a cheat code that I like to show my kids. And this works for FRQ2, the rhetorical analysis on the AP Lang exam, but I also use this for FRQ1 and FRQ2 for the literature exam. So implicit in the prompt, you have two questions. The first is, how does the author construct meaning? And the second is, what is the authorial intent? You'll notice there's a 3 and a 1 placed next to each question. I want my students to write 4 sentences for their introduction, and 3 of the sentences are going to address how does the author construct meaning. So they usually lead with those 3 sentences. That constitutes and comprises the thesis statement. So that's why we call it a declarative thesis. When you declare, you start with the thesis. And then 1 sentence on author's intent. So we call it the 3+1. Graphically, it looks like this. So there's some big components that you want to throw in here. I like to see a smattering of tier 2 level vocab. And what I mean by that is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level words. I don't want them to overcook it, and assume that if they use $1 million words that somehow they're doing impressive writing, but they do have an academic audience. So should be elevated a tad bit. I do a ton of work with my students on the 12-sentence types and the 20-sentence patterns. I got a ton of stuff in my YouTube channel on that if you want to teach your students how to achieve better voice, rhythm, and flow in their writing. I do ask my students to start with a duo in the introductory paragraph, and I'll model that in just a second. Verb choice is mighty important. So I want my kids to get away from simple to be verbs, uses, says. Verbs like that tend to weaken the pizzazz of an introductory paragraph. You have to give a little bit of context and background, but be careful not to get overly plot summative. And as I've already said, in a 3+1, you begin with the thesis because you're starting with the construction of meaning. So One thing that I tell my teachers all the time when I do trainings is that you got to Bob Ross your instruction. And what I mean by that is you got to get you the proverbial easel and canvas and paint with and for your students a la Bob Ross. So he used a heuristic called the wet on wet technique. And I always use for rhetorical analysis the declarative thesis and the syllogistic method. So I'm a big believer in heuristics, and I think it's really good practice when teachers write in front of their students. I know that's a terrifying prospect for some of you, but it really helps demystify things and shows kids explicitly that we struggle too, and I think there's valuable teaching in that. So let's paint a few. Here's exemplar number 1. Wry and provocative. That's what I mean by a duo. So wry 1, provocative 2. That's the duo. I really like it when my students begin like that because it precludes them from getting all plot summative and reading, like a Spark Note summary of the speech. So they begin right with analytical statements. So wry and provocative, Chieng uses comedy to expose the dangers of society's growing dependence on artificial intelligence. He frames AI as a threat not because it will replace human beings, but because it tempts them to abandon authentic thinking. Through his mockery of technological shortcuts, he reinforces the value of intellectual engagement and personal mastery. Ultimately, Chieng cautions Harvard's graduates to resist convenience when it weakens the very habit that make meaningful growth possible. So one of the things that I talk about with my students is the art of implication. I don't like introductions that are really explicit where kids are saying ethos, pathos, logos, juxtaposition, dichotomy, extended metaphor. I think it's more skillful to imply the terms. You can drop some explication. Like, for example, it's really hard to say irony without saying irony. But all the others can be implied. So you'll see in this, the sentence constructs don't run parallel to each other. There's not that ... rhythm and flow that's created when struggling and emerging writers over rely on independent clauses. So I dig that about this. The verbs are really good in here. I did use uses because I want to show my students that we can opt in a better verb than that. So I just wanted that to be a teachable moment because a lot of my kids beginning of the year, they get so hung up on uses and all the to be's and stuff. So the verbs are cooking. They're really good. It's just a classic straight up 3+1. Let's paint another one and take a look at sample number 2. Again, it's going to begin with the duo. Satirical and cautionary, Chieng employs humor to confront the growing tendency to treat artificial intelligence as a replacement for human effort. He repeatedly undermines, again, note the better verbs here, this is good. So he undermines the perceived sophistication of AI, exposing the weaknesses that emerge when people rely upon it uncritically. Beneath the laughter, he develops a serious argument that meaningful growth requires sustained engagement rather than technological shortcuts. Ultimately, Chieng warns graduates that preserving their intellectual independence will be far more valuable than embracing every new innovation. And again, it's just a classic 3+1. Stagger those sentence constructs, get popping with the verbs, and lean into implication more than explication in these. So number 3 is going to follow the exact same heuristic of the 3+1, and it'll look like this. Start with that duo. Sardonic and reflective, Chieng examines the cultural obsession with artificial intelligence through a blend of comedy and criticism. By presenting exaggerated examples of AI dependence, he reveals a deeper concern about the erosion of authentic learning and personal development. His progression from absurd jokes to genuine reflection encourages listeners to reconsider what is lost when convenience becomes the highest priority. Ultimately, Chieng challenges Harvard's graduates to cultivate genuine expertise, arguing that fulfillment emerges from the process of learning rather than the avoidance of it. So again, I think it's really important, especially early in the year, to get kids away from just, dump trucking rhetorical terms, devices, and techniques in their intros. I spend a lot of time teaching them synonyms of, ethos and pathos and logos so that it's skillfully implied instead of being so in your face. So the question becomes, how about those body paragraphs? How do I write those? So we use the syllogistic method. It comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often tussle with these juicy, pithy, essential questions like, what is justice? Which is the core question in Plato's Republic. And he noted one day that the really good orators have like a mathematical precision to their logic. And he said, aha, I got it. They're using syllogisms. And what that means is you're just arguing from premise to conclusion. So if I were to say to you in premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you'd all nod your head and say, yep, Christian, you are correct. Premise 2, if I bring in some textual support and say, my dog ate arsenic, and I flesh it out a little bit and say, this morning I went to make a cup of coffee, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw Pickles, my dog, beneath the kitchen sink. And I said, oh no, Pickles. And he pulls out his head and he's got white powder all over his muzzle and his grizzle. And then I flesh it out even more and say, last night I put arsenic beneath the kitchen sink cupboards because we have a rat infestation problem. You naturally are going to conclude, that's not going to bode well for Pickles the dog. Pickles is going to die. Morbid example, but you see the point here. If we morph this into a heuristic to write a rhetorical analysis, premise number 1 is going to be an argument containing terms, devices, and techniques. And again, if you explicate up top in the thesis, you want to imply or use a synonym. I always tell my students that repetition's the bane of the author's existence. So you got to use different terminology in the first premise if you're recycling. Premise 2 is textual support, and this is where you want to quote and or paraphrase. So there's some math to this. A first premise is 3 sentences long. And I want it to be 3 sentences because we are doing expository writing. We are requiring our kids to do rhetorical analysis, not rhetorical summation. So to keep the argument central, I like to take 3 sentences there. And it also allows them to multitask and tackle a few terms at once instead of doing 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph pathos, because that's too dutiful and simplistic. So the conclusion is going to be the textual analysis, and this is where you add your commentary and you link it back to the prompt and the thesis. One little last piece of math, a syllogistic body paragraph is going to be 10 to 12 sentences. So the question becomes, what's a first premise look like? Here it is. I use stems with my students early in the academic year, and they always begin with right from the onset. I like it when my kids go chronologically through a text, and this cues the reader to know that you have this real nice methodological approach to your analysis, that you're going to go in sequence and you're going to be very dutiful in terms of keeping that line of reasoning intact. So we always begin right from the onset. So check this out. Right from the onset, Chieng dismantles the prestige and seriousness typically associated with Harvard by subjecting its recent grade inflation controversy to relentless ridicule. That's the first thing he does, right? So you start from the top of the passage. Through a barrage of sarcastic observations and audience-directed commentary, He established an irreverent tone that invites listeners to laugh at institutions they've long been taught to revere. So you can see here, I'm getting a little bit more expletive in my analysis here. Like, I want my kids to explicate, be clear what terms, devices, techniques they're using. This humorous opening lowers his audience's defenses while simultaneously positioning him as a speaker willing to challenge conventional assumptions rather than simply celebrate them. So 3 sentences. You're still doing the same thing with the verbs and the sentence constructs and the tier 2 that stay static throughout the whole paper. So let's see it again, and just to really shore up and solidify how to do this first premise. So again, start with that stem. Right from the onset, Chieng rejects the polished decorum traditionally expected of commencement speakers, opting instead for a style rooted in mockery and blunt honesty. His playful attacks on grade inflation and Harvard's academic culture transform the audience from passive spectators into active participants in the joke. By creating an atmosphere of shared laughter, he establishes credibility not through prestige or authority, but through a willingness to speak candidly about issues others might avoid. So again, always 3 sentences, a little blend, teeter-totter blend of explication and implication goes a long way in that. So let's transition to the second premise. So here I stop writing and I say, what's the promise of the first premise? What terms, devices, and techniques have I hinted at or explicitly stated? To keep the line of reasoning intact, I get very deliberate with my quote selection. In the 4th sentence is where I like students to begin to quote. All right, so check this out. Immediately, and my students always say immediately because it ties back to right from the onset to keep the line of reasoning intact. So that's a stem we use. Immediately, the speaker signals his rejection of commencement convention. He sarcastically congratulates graduates on being the last generation of Harvard grads with straight A's before wondering whether the university's professors have only now realized that everyone was receiving inflated grades. So let me talk about this. I have videos in my YouTube channel about embedding quotes seamlessly and quote frames. I like to use something called the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, it should sound conversational, but you might at times need to use ellipses or brackets or things of that nature. So that's just a standard quote frame right there. Let's look at some others. Mocking the institution's delayed response, he incredulously asks, "Do you know how stupid that is? Didn't you guys go to Harvard?" So again, quote frames are important. I want to see my students use ellipses and brackets and sometimes have quote sandwiches, sometimes use multiple quotes in one sentence. All right, repetition's the bane of the author's existence, so you got to switch up your quote frames. Through this barrage of rhetorical questioning, Chieng invites the audience to laugh at an institution they've spent years revering. So you got to get into the commentary here. The humor is particularly effective because it directs criticism upward rather than at the graduates themselves. And then in terms of the commentary, I have something called the 1-2-3 rule. Sometimes one sentence of commentary is enough, but sometimes you got to go 2 or 3 sentences. And you want to oscillate between that so that you're not just doing one sentence commentary, because, again, repetition's the bane of the author's existence. Consequently, listeners become willing participants in the joke rather than defensive subjects of it. Chieng further cultivates this atmosphere when he playfully notes that the interpreter already has a sign for President Trump trying to destroy you before assuring him that it gets worse. So you can see there are 2 quotes in one sentence. So all the quote frames are advanced so far. This unscripted aside creates the illusion of spontaneity, making the speech feel more like a conversation than a formal address. Such moments humanize the speaker and narrow the distance between celebrity and audience. As a result, Chieng establishes credibility through candor and reliability rather than prestige alone. So this is the conclusion part where you wrap it all back up. Having secured the audience's trust through laughter, he positions himself to introduce more substantial criticisms later in the address. So that would be one syllogism. Question becomes, what do I do next? And this is where the glory of heuristics comes in. You just bust out another syllogism. So a first premise to continue the essay might look like this. As the address progresses, Chieng shifts from poking fun at Harvard's culture to scrutinizing society's growing dependence on artificial intelligence. So this is kind of the meat and potatoes of the speech. Although his criticism remains wrapped in comedy and exaggeration, the humor increasingly serves as a vehicle for exploring the consequences of intellectual complacency. By repeatedly contrasting technological convenience with authentic engagement, he develops a cautionary argument that challenges graduates to remain active participants in their own learning. So that is an example of like how you would continue the essay. Same process, go quote hunting. Once you've reached that stage, keep the line of reasoning intact by asking the question, what's the promise of the first premise? So let's wrap the essay up and tag a conclusion on this. Early in the academic year, I like to use stems and the following analogy. A conclusion paragraph is like the grand finale of a fireworks display. It's all-encompassing, the encapsulation of the entire speech. So simple stems like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done at the end of the day, help students wrap it up. And it just takes like 4 sentences at the end. So we might do something like this. At the end of the day, Chieng's commencement address succeeds because it disguises serious concerns beneath a steady stream of humor. What begins as a series of irreverent jokes gradually evolves into a thoughtful warning about the dangers of intellectual complacency in an age increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence. His ability to balance entertainment with reflection allows his message to resonate without sounding preachy or alarmist. Consequently, graduates leave not only amused by his comedy, but also challenged to preserve the curiosity, discipline, and independent thinking that meaningful achievement requires. All right, so that's the whole essay. If you want to reach out to me for any reason, you can drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. So I'm always looking to up the ante with my rhetorical analysis units each year. I like to switch things out. Again, it mitigates the cheating that often occurs at my school, and there's not a lot online written about this. So it kind of precludes them from cheating. And as I've said in other videos, I'm going back to pen and paper next year, getting away from Chromebooks. And this is a great conversation piece to talk about why I'm doing that. So 2 birds, 1 stone. So I hope you found that useful, and be well for now.